Hey guys, tonight we descend into the fragrant, or perhaps fermented is the better word, world of Victorian hygiene. Where soap was suspicious, doctors prescribed mercury as casually as cough drops, and cologne doubled as both perfume and chemical weapon. Before we dive into bedbugs, chamber pots, and communal bathwater that looked like weak tea by the fourth bather, take a second to like the video and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see who's out there listening, whether you're curled up at midnight in London, sipping coffee in New York, or hiding from mosquitoes in Southeast Asia. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Picture yourself in a Victorian bedroom, the mattress stuffed with straw that scratches your back, the sheets unwashed since who knows when, and the faint tickle on your arm that could be a flea, a spider, or simply your imagination doing its cruel midnight dance. You splash your face with icy water from a basin, pat dry with a towel stiff enough to double as a medieval shield, and step into the foggy streets where horse manure, coal soot, and somebody else's cough all compete for your attention. But our journey doesn't stop there. Once we've scratched our way through Victorian grime, we'll head back even further to Rome, the empire of bread, circuses, and banquets so bizarre they made flamingo tongues and peacock brains the height of culinary fashion. From straw beds to marble arenas, tonight's tale is equal parts dirty, dazzling and unforgettable. Waking up in a Victorian bedroom. The morning begins not with sunlight streaming through a clear window, nor with the comfort of a warm feather bed, but with the stale heaviness of Victorian air. In mid-19th century Britain, the average bedroom was less a sanctuary and more a chamber of compromise, where comfort bowed to the realities of poverty, coal smoke and dubious hygiene. To awaken in such a room was to begin the day already carrying the burden of soot, dampness and itch. The very air seemed hostile. Coal was the fuel of empire, powering factories, trains and kitchens, but it also filled every crevice of domestic life. Even with the fireplace gone cold through the night, a thin film of soot and dust hung invisibly in the air. Each breath carried the memory of the city's chimneys. Doctors might later speak of the black lung of the poor, but for ordinary families, this was simply the smell of home. The bed itself was hardly an escape. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, horsehair, or sometimes a motley mix of whatever the family could afford. Over time, these fillings compacted, molded, and grew colonies of pests. Fleas and lice did not discriminate between rich and poor. They thrived wherever warmth and fabric endured. The wealthy might have better coverings, even imported linens, but unless laundered regularly, and laundry was grueling, expensive work, all beds shared the same fate. They itched. Most Victorians slept in their day clothes, or at least in heavy undergarments. Nightgowns and pajamas existed, but undressing every evening was viewed as extravagant, even immodest, unless one lived in the upper classes. For the majority, staying clothed seemed safer and more efficient, particularly in homes where heat was scarce and privacy rarer still. In fact, a traveller from France once remarked, half amused, half horrified, that the English seemed to treat nightly disrobing as a form of theatre rather than routine. The sheets, if they could still be called sheets, were seldom washed. Soap was expensive, and washing large linens required hours of boiling water, scrubbing, wringing and drying in the open air. Families often went months before laundering bedclothes, relying instead on shaking them out and pretending the dust and crawling specks were imaginary. In truth, everyone knew the tiny creatures were there. One simply learned to endure them. To rise from such a bed was to carry with you the ghost of the night. The itching never truly stopped. That sensation on your shoulder, was it a flea, a spider, or simply the memory of being bitten? The uncertainty gnawed at you as much as the insects themselves. You stretched, inhaled the musty air and prepared for a day that would begin not with freshness, but with resignation. Furniture offered little relief. The washstand, usually a wooden table or cabinet, held a ceramic pitcher of water and a shallow bowl. By morning, a thin film floated on the surface of the water, dust settling overnight or perhaps a trace of rust from the household well. This was your mirror of cleanliness, limited, chilly, and always questionable. Looking into the glass above the washstand was a cruel ritual. Mirrors in the Victorian age were not flawless sheets of clarity, but often cloudy, warped, and framed with wood that smelled faintly of smoke. They reflected not only your face, but also your fatigue. Hair often stood wild, greasy from weeks without washing, tangled into something between a bird's nest and a battlefield. Without shampoo, an imported French idea only the rich dared try, most people rubbed animal grease or castor oil into their hair to keep it manageable. The result was a shine, yes, but one born more of oil than of health. Even simple stretching risked inhaling more soot. Every fireplace, no matter how long extinguished, released particles that never seemed to settle. Soot embedded itself into curtains, into clothing, into skin. It clung as faithfully as any loyal companion, only far less helpful. To cough in, the morning was normal. To spit black phlegm into a handkerchief was unremarkable. This was not illness. This was London or Manchester or Birmingham or any city that thrived on coal. And yet, despite the discomfort, most Victorians greeted the day with the grim determination of people who had long since adjusted. The measure of cleanliness was not whether one felt fresh, but whether one could pass in public without embarrassment. In an age before germ theory took hold, hygiene was as much about appearances as about health. Dirt under the fingernails might earn a frown from a neighbor, but it rarely led to soap and water. Instead, people comforted themselves with the knowledge that everyone else was just as grimy. This shared condition created a strange sort of solidarity. Complaining about the itch of fleas or the smell of the sheets was pointless. Everyone lived with the same afflictions. A nobleman scratching his scalp during Parliament was no more immune than a factory worker in the mill. The pests cared little for class distinctions, only for warmth and flesh. Thus, the Victorian bedroom was not simply a place to rest. It was the first battlefield of the day, where one woke already defeated by soot, itch, and dampness. To rise from bed was to accept that the day would carry the same grime forward, only masked with a touch of water, a stiff towel, and perhaps, if fortune allowed, a dab of scented oil. And so, with weary resignation, the day began. Morning wash, the basin, the rag, the cold water. The washstand stood patiently in the corner, as it always did. A simple piece of furniture with one purpose, to remind you how limited cleanliness could be in the Victorian era. Upon it sat a pitcher filled the night before, and a shallow bowl that was supposed to serve as your morning salvation. But salvation was too generous a word. The water, left to sit for hours, gathered dust, a faint skin across its surface that hinted at mystery substances no one dared question. Some mornings the faint tang of iron lingered, betraying its journey from pipes or a well. This water was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be endured. You cupped your hands, dipped into the bowl, and splashed the cold liquid onto your face. The shock was immediate, like plunging into a winter pond. Your skin tightened, pores shrieked, and your breath caught in your throat. For a moment you felt half awake, half assaulted. It was cleansing only in the sense that it startled you into consciousness. Cleanliness was secondary. The towel waiting beside the basin was no ally. Towels in the 19th century were often coarse, stiff, and used far longer than modern sensibilities would allow. This one smelled faintly of porridge and smoke, as if yesterday's breakfast still clung to its fibers. When pressed to the skin, it scratched rather than dried, smearing the dampness across your face in uneven streaks. In moments like these, one could understand why doctors warned against bathing. Victorian physicians, still clinging to pre-germ theory beliefs, often preached the dangers of overwashing. Too much water, they insisted, weakened the constitution. It opened the pores, inviting illness and even moral corruption. Dirt, they reasoned, was nature's protective shield. Thus, to dab your face and neck with icy water was not only sufficient, it was virtuous moderation. A full bath? That was suspicious, even decadent. The sensation lingered as you worked the cloth over your arms, neck, and perhaps, if bravery struck, your ankles. Anything beyond these exposed regions was considered unnecessary. After all, why wash what polite society would never see? Victorians cared less about the reality of cleanliness and more about its performance. A face wiped down, a collar brushed, a faint scent of soap lingering on the hands. These were enough to pass inspection in the streets or in church pews. The irony was palpable. In a world ravaged by cholera outbreaks, where entire neighborhoods fell to diseases spread through contaminated water, people still distrusted water itself. To bathe too often was to court weakness. To avoid bathing was to build fortitude. Thus the basin became both a tool and a symbol of restraint. A little water, carefully applied to appear clean without straying into extravagance. When the ritual was done, you were not fresh. You were damp. And in the Victorian imagination, damp was the closest one could reasonably come to clean on a daily basis. You looked into the clouded mirror, hair sticking at odd angles, skin blotched from the cold, and nodded to yourself. By the standards of the day, you were presentable. And presentability was survival. The fear of bathing and the sponge ritual. The true bath was not part of daily life. It was an event, a ceremony wrapped in equal parts suspicion and discomfort. Most households saved it for once a week, perhaps even once a month, depending on fortune and firewood. For the other days, there was the sponge. The sponge, once a living sea creature, now resembled a stiff, bread-like object. Its surface was rough, its pores holding the memories of every previous wash. You dipped it into the basin of cloudy water, wrung it with resignation, and pressed it to your skin. Cold again, always cold. The gasp that followed was involuntary, a startled sound somewhere between a goose and a curse. You dabbed the face, neck, underarms. Anything beyond was optional, even daring. Legs, shins, or, heaven forbid, the torso required more privacy, more commitment than most could muster before breakfast. Nudity was a moral hazard, whispered about in tones of disapproval. To strip completely was to flirt with impropriety. Thus the sponge bath balanced between modesty and necessity, a delicate choreography of half measures. The water itself was suspect. Rarely boiled, firewood was for cooking, not luxury. Its faint odor of minerals and dust clung to your skin. Sometimes, if drawn from a well, it carried the memory of something that had died upstream. But there it was, your only option. Soap existed, but it was harsh. A block of animal fat and lye that stripped skin as much as it cleansed. Many households saved it for laundry or Sunday best. When you finished, the towel absorbed little more than your dignity. Damp patches lingered, the smell of the sponge now mixed with your own. And yet, despite the discomfort, a quiet pride emerged. You had washed, by Victorian reckoning, a noble achievement. You would carry this faint freshness into the day like a badge of effort, knowing that by Thursday it would be gone, but for now it was enough. The ritual said less about hygiene than about identity. To sponge oneself was to show restraint, modesty, and perseverance. It was not about health. It was about being acceptably clean in a society that mistrusted excess and worshipped appearances. Victorian hair care and the reign of lice, if the body could be persuaded into a semblance of cleanliness. The hair told another story entirely. To uncover one's head in the morning was to reveal a battlefield. Hair had grown greasy overnight, tangled into a mass somewhere between hay and storm cloud. Without shampoo, still an exotic French import, Victorians relied on animal fats or castor oil to tame it. Bear grease was popular, though its smell could be overwhelming, a musky note that clung for days. Brushing was a communal affair. A single brush, its bristles stiff with boar hair, passed through the hands of every family member, sometimes even the household dog. To drag it through your own locks was to inherit the residue of others. It snagged on knots, tugged at the scalp, and often revealed more than hair. Lice. Lice were the quiet companions of the 19th century. Ubiquitous, unavoidable, and oddly normalized, they infested homes across all classes. From the factory worker to the parliament clerk, no one was immune. Families scratched, picked, and sometimes even named their unwelcome guests. Children joked about them. Adults endured them. Apothecaries sold powders and tonics promising relief, but the infestations always returned. Women faced the greater burden. Their hair, worn long and coiled into elaborate buns, could go months without washing. Hair washing required not only heated water, but time, privacy, and a willingness to suffer through the process. Bending over a basin, neck straining, water trickling into eyes and ears, few attempted it regularly. Instead, styles concealed the reality. Pins, combs, and ribbons transformed unwashed locks into symbols of respectability. Men fared only slightly better. Shorter hair meant less entanglement, but pomades, mixtures of grease and perfume, glued strands into stiff waves that looked tidy but trapped dirt and soot. Hats worn daily compounded the problem, pressing oils deeper into the scalp. Removing one's hat indoors sometimes unleashed a faint odor, which polite society ignored with studied silence. The presence of lice was not shameful. It was simply Victorian. Like soot in the lungs or fleas in the bedding, they were facts of life. The brush clicked through hair, snagged, pulled free, and carried its living cargo onward to the next user. This was diplomacy of the age. Avoid confrontation with the creatures that bite, and carry on as if their existence were no more troubling than the weather. By the time you finished, your hair gleamed not with cleanliness, but with a sheen of oil, smoke, and effort. You pinned it back, smoothed the edges, and sighed. To modern eyes, it might seem grimy. To Victorian eyes, it was presentable. And presentable was all that mattered. Toothbrushes of pig bristle and rotten dentistry. The Victorian smile, if one could call it that, was less about pearly whites and more about endurance. To wake each morning and tend to one's teeth was to face a series of compromises that few today would recognize as hygiene. In truth, dental care in the 19th century was an uneven mixture of inherited folk practices, questionable powders, and sheer resignation. The toothbrush itself was an object of menace. Carved wooden handles with stiff bristles made of pig hair were the norm. The bristles were not uniform nor particularly soft. Some stuck out at odd angles, stiffened by age, use, or simply poor craftsmanship. Running such a tool across one's teeth felt more like scrubbing cobblestones than tending to enamel. Yet it was the best option available, and so it was used with a grim sense of duty. To pair with the brush came the powders, an endless assortment of concoctions blended in kitchens, apothecaries, or sometimes improvised from what lay at hand. Chalk, crushed charcoal, salt, and even brick dust made appearances in these mixtures. Mint, as we understand it, was largely absent. Instead, the taste was more akin to licking a cellar wall, earthy, metallic, and faintly bitter. Some powders attempted to sweeten the experience with cinnamon or clove, but they rarely masked the harsher flavors. The goal was not whiteness or freshness. It was survival. Teeth, after all, were fragile in an age when sugar consumption was climbing and dentistry remained primitive. The average Victorian lived with cavities, abscesses, and missing teeth as a matter of course. Pain was constant. Solutions were brutal. If a tooth hurt too badly, there was no recourse but extraction. And extractions were not gentle affairs. Dentists, when available, worked without anesthetic. Their tools were simple: pliers, clamps, and brute force. The unlucky patient sat in a chair while a stout man with calloused hands wrestled the offending tooth from its socket. Screams were expected. Fainting was common. Infection afterward was likely. The wealthy might import rudimentary fillings or prosthetics, but for most the answer was simply fewer teeth. Children were not spared. Milk teeth decayed quickly on diets heavy in bread and jam, and parents often shrugged, seeing rotten baby teeth as an inevitable step toward adulthood. Adults, meanwhile, became adept at chewing with half a mouth, avoiding certain foods or smiling with lips pressed tightly together to conceal the ruin inside. The lack of floss meant food remained lodged between teeth until it rotted or was teased free by the tongue. Small bones, grains, and seeds lingered stubbornly, sometimes leading to infection. To ease the pain, Victorians swished with salt water, brandy, or gin. The alcohol numbed for a time, but the ache always returned, and yet this was normal. Everyone suffered. Poets, peasants, aristocrats, all shared the same dental burdens. Bad breath was universal, cavities unavoidable, and extractions a rite of passage. When a tooth finally fell into the wash basin during morning cleaning, one did not cry out. One simply spat, grimaced, and carried on. In the Victorian world, the measure of dental hygiene was not perfection but persistence. To still have teeth at all was an achievement. Sense of the era. Cologne as a shield if daily bathing was impractical, the Victorians turned to fragrance. Scent became both shield and statement, a way of presenting oneself as respectable, even while the body beneath told a different story. To apply cologne was not indulgence. It was survival in a society where every street corner reeked of manure, smoke, and sweat. On a typical dresser sat a glass bottle, amber liquid swirling within, sealed with cork or wax. The labels promised refinement, imperial essence, we gentlemen's number 9, but the reality was harsher. Ingredients ranged from alcohol and musk to turpentine, clove, and whatever oils the perfumer could acquire. The result was a concoction that stung the skin and overwhelmed the senses. One dabbed generously, on wrists, behind ears, across the chest. Some men applied it beneath the arms, replacing soap with sheer force of scent. The sting was sharp, but it passed quickly, leaving behind a cloud of fragrance that preceded its wearer by several steps. Dogs whined, neighbors coughed, but society understood. Better to smell of effort than of cabbage and coal. The wealthy indulged in imported perfumes from France. These were subtler, infused with rose, sandalwood, or lavender, though still heavy by modern standards. Middle-class households settled for domestic blends, harsher and cheaper, but sufficient to mask reality. The poor sometimes resorted to vinegar rubbed into armpits, calling it astringent with brave conviction. Subtlety was not a Victorian virtue. Men drenched themselves in bay rum until they risked igniting near the hearth. Women steeped in rose water until they resembled walking bouquets. The very air of a drawing room often shimmered with competing aromas, mingling with coal smoke and damp wool. A guest's arrival could be sensed long before their knock. Fragrance carried meaning beyond hygiene. To wear cologne was to declare respectability. It was a public signal that one was not indifferent, that one made an effort to be tolerable among others. In this way, scent became a form of social currency. The right fragrance elevated, the wrong one condemned, but any was better than none. So you splashed the burning liquid onto your skin, flinched, and inhaled the sharp, resinous cloud. The sting faded. The smell lingered, and with it came confidence, however misplaced. The cologne did not make you clean, but it made you Victorian clean, and that was enough. The dread of public bathhouses. For those who dared pursue true cleanliness, there remained the public bath. In imagination, the phrase suggested luxury, marble halls, steaming pools, civility. In practice, it was little more than a dungeon of shared water and quiet despair. You entered clutching a towel, coins ready for the attendant, and stepped into a world of steam heavy with human presence. The air was thick, damp, and tinged with something faintly organic. The communal tubs sat in rows, filled not with fresh water but with a murky broth of history. Brownish, opaque, it carried the residue of every body that had soaked before you. Strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, submerged in the same liquid. No one spoke. Only the occasional splash broke the oppressive quiet. To immerse oneself was to surrender dignity. You lowered into the warmth, flinching at the slime beneath your feet. Warmth, yes, but not the warmth of purity. It was the warmth of bodies recycled again and again. The soap, if one could call it that, rested on a communal ledge. Hair clung to its surface, evidence of countless hands and armpits. You picked it up anyway, lathered as best you could, and tried to ignore the knowledge that this bar had served a dozen others that very morning. To wash here was to suspend disbelief, to pretend that the dirt leaving your body was not immediately absorbed by your neighbors. Privacy was impossible. Men shaved in the water. Children splashed without reprimand. Towels disappeared when unattended, replaced by others already damp and smelling faintly of mildew. By the time you stepped out, you were clean by definition only. Spiritually, you felt diminished, as though the bath had scrubbed away not just grime but also hope. And yet, it was still preferable to the alternative, weeks without washing. So you endured, dried yourself with a stranger's towel, and walked back into the street. The cool air struck your skin like rebirth, though you knew the sensation would not last. Soon the soot and sweat of the city would reclaim you. But for one fleeting moment you were technically clean. Clothing layers, undergarments and stiff fabrics to be Victorian was to be buried alive, not in earth but in fabric. Clothes did not merely cover the body. They confined it, pressed it, shaped it and suffocated it, until modesty triumphed over comfort. A person's wardrobe was less a personal choice than a declaration of class, morality and endurance. To dress in the morning was to don armor, stitched from wool, linen and expectation. It began with the undergarments. For men, this meant long drawers, sturdy linen or cotton, white only in theory, extending from waist to ankle. For women, the ordeal was far greater. They stepped into chemises, laced corsets until ribs groaned, and added layers of petticoats that swayed like the rings of a felled tree. Each garment had its logic. The chemise protected skin from coarse fabrics, the corset shaped posture, the petticoats expanded skirts into respectable bell-like silhouettes. Together they transformed the human form into a moral sculpture. Laundry, however, was scarce. Clean clothes often meant garments worn for 3 or 4 days straight, brushed but not washed. Soap was harsh, water costly, and labor immense. Thus the cleanliness of clothes was judged less by smell and more by presentation. If the collar was starch stiff, if the fabric held its shape, then all was well, even if beneath lay sweat. Lice and skin rubbed raw by seams. For men, the shirt was the true undergarment, always white, always long-sleeved, and rarely changed. Over it came the waistcoat, trousers, and jacket, each layer insulating against drafts while also trapping every drop of perspiration. In crowded streets or smoky taverns, the stench of damp wool was inescapable. Women's corsets deserved their own tragedies. Laced tight, they shifted organs, constricted lungs, and caused fainting spells that society misread as signs of delicate femininity. Yet, despite rumors of crushed ribs and deformed waists, women persisted. Without a corset, one was judged indecent, sloppy, even immoral. Her straight back and narrow waist were not just fashion but virtue. Above the corset came bodices, skirts, and shawls, layers upon layers that swaddled the body until only the face and hands emerged into the world. In summer, this meant sweat dripping beneath wool and linen, trapped against skin that rarely saw the sun. In winter, it meant dampness that froze into discomfort. But either way, modesty was achieved, and modesty was everything. Children fared no better. Boys in stiff jackets and caps resembled miniature adults, their movements restricted, their collars scratching. Girls wore miniature versions of their mothers' dresses, complete with corset-like bodices. Childhood comfort was not a concept. Discipline was. The irony was sharp. While physicians warned against bathing, no one warned against clothing that hindered breath and bruised ribs. The body could survive weeks without soap, but not a single day without the approval conferred by proper dress. To be seen in public without appropriate layers was shameful, nearly scandalous. Thus, as you fastened the final button or pinned the last shawl, you accepted the daily burden. You were heavy, stiff, overheated, and itchy, yet you were respectable. And in Victorian society, respectability outweighed comfort every time. The Privian chamber pot. Victorian toilet habits. Hygiene in any civilization can be measured by its toilets. By that measure, Victorian Britain was a study in contradictions. Inventors tinkered with water closets and sewer systems, while the majority still relied on chamber pots and backyard privies. The morning ritual was not complete until one faced this unavoidable necessity. For many, the chamber pot lived under the bed, tucked discreetly away until needed. It was ceramic, sometimes tin, sometimes even painted with floral designs. An attempt at dignity for an object whose purpose was anything but. At night, when cold or rain discouraged trips outdoors, families used it freely. By morning, it required emptying. The unlucky member of the household carried it, sloshing, to be dumped into the privy or worse, into the gutter. Privies were wooden outhouses, planks nailed together around a pit or barrel. They stood at the edge of yards, alleys, or tenements, their doors crooked, their interiors dim. A seat, often no more than a board with a hole, hovered above the void. In summer, the stench was unbearable. In winter, the seat froze and skin recoiled at the touch. Flies and rats treated the privy as their domain. Wealthier homes experimented with water closets, porcelain thrones connected to cisterns and, theoretically, to sewers. Yet the sewers themselves were primitive, often carrying waste directly into rivers. In London, the Thames became a ribbon of filth, its stench so powerful during the Great Stink of 1858 that Parliament fled its chambers. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette would later transform sanitation. But for much of the century, human waste remained humanity's most visible failure. For the poor, another figure loomed, the night soil man. Under cover of darkness, he emptied cesspits, hauling barrels of excrement through silent streets to dump outside the city. His work was loathed yet indispensable. Without him, neighborhoods drowned in their own refuse. Children mocked him, adults avoided his gaze, but all relied on his grim profession. Conversation about toilets was taboo. Families endured smells and discomfort without comment, as though silence itself could mask the reality. Women in particular faced hardship, lacking privacy, and often holding their bladders until pain set in. Doctors quietly diagnosed female complaints without daring to address the obvious, the lack of sanitary facilities. Thus, the morning ended not with relief, but with resignation. The privy door creaked shut, the chamber pot was rinsed as best it could be, and the day continued. Cleanliness may have been the goal of society, but in this matter, it was the one goal no one could achieve. Night battles, beds, fleas, and bedbugs. If the day brought soot, sweat, and odor, the night offered its own horrors. To climb into bed was to enter a battlefield where the enemy was small, tireless, and legion. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs ruled the darkness, feeding without fear, reminding sleepers that hygiene was not a personal failing, but a universal curse. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or horsehair, both magnets for vermin. With every toss or turn, tiny bodies stirred within, crawling to find the warmth of human skin. Blankets rarely fared better, unwashed for weeks, their folds alive with invisible colonies. A clean bed was an aspiration, not a reality. The biting began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A faint itch on the ankle, a sting along the wrist, then another and another, until sleep was broken by frantic scratching. Children whimpered, adults groaned, but no one could escape. The insects were too many, too entrenched. By morning, red welts marked their victories, souvenirs of the night war. Solutions existed, but they were half measures at best. Some families sprinkled vinegar or lavender to deter pests. Others rubbed their skin with camphor or sulfur. Powdered mercury was sometimes suggested, though it poisoned as often as it protected. Farmers swore by laying leaves of mint or wormwood between sheets, but the bugs adapted, as relentless as poverty itself. The wealthy imported iron bedsteads, believing metal deterred infestation. They fared slightly better, though even gilt frames could not resist determined bedbugs. For the poor, straw was replaced only when it rotted, and even then vermin moved from the old pile into the new. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep never came easily when one feared the creeping tickle of unseen legs. Many rose at dawn not refreshed but exhausted, their bodies marked, their tempers shortened. In this way, the bed, supposed refuge, became another battleground in the endless war between human comfort and nature's persistence. And yet, like everything else in Victorian hygiene, it was endured. People accepted bites as inevitable, like soot or bad teeth. They scratched, dressed, and carried on, too weary to hope for better. After all, everyone else suffered the same. Misery, like lice, was simply part of life. Family bath day, shared tubs and filthy water. In many Victorian households, bath day was less a matter of hygiene and more a family ordeal. It did not happen daily, nor even every other day, but once a week, most often on Saturday evening, when the week's grime could be washed away before Sunday service. Yet for all its promise of cleanliness, bath day was anything but refreshing. The ritual began at dawn. The mother or eldest daughter filled kettles and pots, heating water on the range until the kitchen swelled with steam. Firewood or coal burned steadily, its cost felt in every shilling pinched from the family budget. Once hot, the water was poured into a tin or wooden tub set in the center of the room, often beside the fire for warmth. Then cold water was added, until the level reached an acceptable depth. Into this tub went the father first, his position of privilege unquestioned. He soaked, scrubbed, and rinsed, while the family politely looked away or pretended to. When he was done, he stepped out dripping and wrapped himself in a coarse towel. The water, now tinged with the residue of his week's labor, remained. Next came the children, in descending order of age. They splashed in the same murky liquid, the soap bar growing smaller with each use, its surface already dotted with stray hairs. Towels were reused, damp and smelling faintly of mildew. By the time the youngest climbed in, the water was little more than a grey soup of sweat, soot, and floating flecks. The mother bathed last, her sacrifice as invisible as it was constant. She lowered herself into water that had already embraced the entire household. Whatever modest freshness it once held had long since been replaced by fatigue. For her, the bath was less about cleansing and more about obligation, ensuring she too could appear in church respectably, no matter the indignity. Soap, if present, was harsh. Made from animal fat and lye, it burned the skin and left hands raw. Children cried when it touched their eyes, but there was no alternative. Some families reserved soap for Sunday best, relying on water alone for the rest of the week. Hair washing was rarer still. The water would never stretch far enough for that extravagance. When the ritual ended, the tub was emptied, sometimes outdoors, sometimes down a drain, sometimes simply tossed into the gutter. The kitchen floor was mopped, towels hung, and the family dressed in their cleanest clothes. They emerged not so much clean as rebranded, a week's worth of grime disguised under damp skin and starched collars. Bath day was exhausting, humbling, and vaguely humiliating. Yet it was tradition, a badge of respectability that every family endured. In the Victorian world, it was not the reality of cleanliness that mattered, but the appearance of having tried. Doctors, miasma, and misguided treatments. If hygiene in the Victorian age was strange, medical advice was stranger still. Doctors, learned men with beards and pocket watches, often spoke with authority that belied their ignorance. Germ theory was still contested, and the dominant belief was miasma, the idea that foul air carried disease. Thus, cleanliness was measured not in microbes destroyed, but in odors suppressed. A physician entering a patient's home might wrinkle his nose at the smell of unwashed bodies and declare the house unhealthy, not because of invisible bacteria, but because of bad vapors. The solution, he would suggest, was not bathing, but burning incense, opening a window, or carrying a posy of flowers. Some recommended vinegar sprinkled across floors or camphor balls tucked into pockets to ward off cholera or typhoid. Ironically, doctors often discouraged frequent bathing. Too much water, they argued, weakened the constitution, sapped vitality, and left pores open to invasion by illness. Children, they insisted, should be washed only occasionally, lest their young bodies grow frail. The poor, who rarely bathed anyway, welcomed this advice. The rich, meanwhile, complied with sponge baths and perfume, confident that moderation preserved their health. When disease struck, the treatments bordered on cruelty. Bloodletting, though waning, still appeared in medical texts. Calomel, a mercury compound, was prescribed for everything from constipation to coughs, poisoning as often as it cured. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, calmed nerves and dulled pain, but left addicts stumbling through London streets. Doctors reached for these remedies not out of malice, but from habit, tradition, and the lack of better options. Sanitation reformers, meanwhile, faced ridicule. When men like Edwin Chadwick argued that sewage disposal and clean water were essential to public health, critics sneered. They mocked the expense, questioned the science, and accused reformers of alarmism. It was easier to believe in miasma than to imagine invisible creatures lurking in a drop of water. Thus, medical advice often reinforced poor hygiene rather than improved it. Families clung to rituals, vinegar washes, lavender pouches, occasional fumigations, believing themselves safe. Meanwhile, cholera swept through neighborhoods, carried not by air but by water fouled with human waste. The truth waited patiently, its evidence accumulating in morgues and graveyards, until science finally caught up. In the meantime, Victorians endured, trusting their doctors, clutching their camphor balls, and hoping the air remained sweet. Laundry, underwear, and the weekly ritual. If daily bathing was rare, then laundry was rarer still. Washing clothes in the Victorian age was back-breaking labor, a task dreaded by women who bore the brunt of it. It consumed entire days, demanded gallons of water, and left hands raw and aching. The result, more often than not, was clothing that was less dirty rather than truly clean. Undergarments bore the heaviest burden. For men, long drawers and shirts absorbed sweat, soot, and lice. For women, chemises clung damp beneath corsets, absorbing every discomfort. So ideally, these garments would be washed weekly. In practice, they were often worn far longer. Changing into clean underwear might mean donning the least soiled pair rather than a freshly laundered one. Laundry day began before dawn. Buckets of water were hauled from pumps or wells, then heated in large kettles over fires. Soap, if available, was shaved from harsh blocks of tallow and lye, its caustic touch burning skin. Clothes were boiled, stirred with paddles, then hauled out steaming. They were scrubbed against washboards, beaten against stones, and wrung until arms ached. The air filled with steam, sweat, and smoke. Children were pressed into service, turning mangles, large rollers that squeezed water from fabric, or carrying baskets of sodden linen to lines strung across yards. In winter, the wet garments froze stiff in the wind, snapping like boards. In summer, they dried stiff with soap residue, scratching the skin of those who wore them. Stains rarely vanished. Soap was crude, bleach unreliable, and fabrics prone to yellowing. Women spent hours rubbing collars and cuffs, only to have them reappear dingy within days. The frustration was endless, yet the effort was necessary. Clean linen was the hallmark of respectability. However grimy the body beneath, a crisp collar and fresh chemise signaled virtue to the world. Thus laundry became not only a chore, but a performance of morality. Women labored to present their families as disciplined, industrious and respectable, even as their knuckles bled from lye and cold water. The irony was cruel. The same society that demanded spotless linen also scorned the women whose hands bore the cost. At the end of the day, shirts hung stiff on lines, drawers sagged, and dresses swayed in the smoky breeze. By nightfall they would be gathered, folded and stacked. Families wore them proudly, even if the freshness lasted only hours. For in Victorian Britain, laundry was not about cleanliness alone, it was about identity, dignity and survival. Rome's bread, circuses and exotic banquets. In ancient Rome, daily life for the common citizen was defined not by marble villas or golden statues, but by survival. 1 million people crammed into the capital, most packed into insulae, rickety apartment blocks where fire was a constant threat and sanitation barely existed. Food was expensive, jobs uncertain, and tempers volatile. The emperors knew well that hungry crowds could topple thrones. Their answer was simple, brilliant, and cynical: feed the masses and distract them. Bread and circuses. The grain dole, known as the annona, became Rome's safety valve. Eligible citizens queued every month to collect their ration of wheat, grain stamped with the emperor's authority. The dole was no act of charity, it was politics in its purest form. Julius Caesar himself learned the danger of cutting it back. When he tried to reduce beneficiaries, the outrage was so fierce he quickly reversed course. Later emperors never forgot the lesson: tamper with the bread supply and you risk riots in the forum. Behind the dole stretched an empire-wide supply chain. Grain flowed from Sicily, Sardinia, and eventually Egypt, Rome's great breadbasket. Enormous ships sailed the Mediterranean, braving storms and pirates. At Ostia, the port of Rome, warehouses filled with grain sacks and administrators tracked every bushel. A single disruption, a bad harvest, a storm-wrecked fleet could spark unrest. Emperors built granaries, stockpiled reserves, and sometimes even accompanied shipments personally, signaling that their legitimacy was bound to full bellies. But bread alone could not keep the restless quiet. Rome needed spectacle. Thus amphitheaters and circuses became tools of control. The Colosseum, with its towering arches, stood not merely as a monument to engineering, but as propaganda carved in stone. Within its walls, tens of thousands watched gladiators clash, beasts hunted, and naval battles staged in flooded arenas. Each fight, each roar of the crowd reinforced the emperor's power. The people might chant for mercy, but the emperor's hand decided life or death. Chariot racing at the Circus Maximus was no less political. Teams, the reds, blues, greens, and whites, commanded fanatical loyalty. Crashes were inevitable. Horses trampled men, and the crowd roared as dust and danger filled the air. Emperors, seated in their gilded boxes, cheered with the people, giving the illusion of unity even as hierarchy was reinforced. The thunder of hooves was not just sport, it was politics in motion. Festivals filled the calendar, nearly half the year marked by holidays. Saturnalia turned social order upside down, with masters serving slaves. Lupercalia unleashed wild fertility rites in the streets. Religious games, the Ludi Romani, honored the gods with chariot races and theatrical plays. For the poor, these festivals were escapes from hunger and hardship. For the elite, they were platforms to display wealth and curry favor. For emperors, they were invaluable theater, proof that Rome's abundance flowed directly from their generosity. And then there were the banquets. To dine with Rome's elite was to witness indulgence transformed into political theater. Guests reclined on couches, servants bustled with silver trays, and poets recited verses between courses. The dishes astonished more than they nourished. Flamingo tongues stewed in honey, peacock brains roasted whole, dormice fattened in jars and glazed with poppy seeds, sea urchins cracked open raw, jellyfish boiled with vinegar, pigs stuffed with sausages that spilled like treasures when carved. The rarer and stranger the food, the greater the prestige of the host. Spices from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper by the ton, all poured into Rome, draining gold eastward, but proving the empire's global reach. Presentation mattered as much as taste. Peacocks were roasted and refeathered for dramatic unveiling. Boars were stuffed with live birds that burst forth when cut. Even desserts were spectacles. Honey cakes, fruit tarts, and wine sweetened into malsum, proof that Rome's appetite extended to every corner of the known world. Not all admired this excess. Stoic philosophers like Seneca condemned it as moral corruption, warning that Rome had traded virtue for gluttony. Satirists like Juvenal mocked nobles who boasted of peacock dishes while citizens starved, coining the very phrase bread and circuses as a bitter critique. Yet criticism never stopped the feasts. For centuries, Rome pacified its poor with bread, dazzled its crowds with games, and displayed its wealth in dining halls. It worked until it didn't. Bread and circuses bought loyalty, but not eternity. They soothed discontent, but they could not cure corruption or stop decline. Rome endured for centuries, but its obsession with spectacle left a warning echo. Distraction may hold a people for a time, but never forever. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher on the throne amid the chaos of Rome's politics and the roar of its arenas, one emperor stood apart, not for his feasts or games, but for his thoughts. Marcus Aurelius, born in 121 CE, was destined for duty more than luxury. Orphaned young, raised by a stern mother and grandfather, he grew into a boy more interested in philosophy than in play. Emperor Hadrian noticed his seriousness, nicknaming him Verissimus, the most truthful. From adolescence, Marcus practiced stoicism, sleeping on the floor wearing coarse cloaks and training his mind to endure hardship. When Antoninus Pius adopted him as heir, Marcus's path was sealed. He would rule Rome, but not as a tyrant. He viewed power as duty, not prize. Married to Faustina, Antoninus's daughter, he raised a large family, though tragedy marked his life as child after child died in infancy. He bore these losses with stoic resignation, reminding himself that nature takes what it gives. In 161 CE, Marcus ascended as emperor, sharing power with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, the first joint emperors. Marcus was the philosopher king, cautious and humble. Verus enjoyed luxury and spectacle, but Marcus endured him with patience, valuing harmony over conflict. Together they faced crisis, the Parthian War in the east and the plague it unleashed upon their return. Likely smallpox, it swept through the empire, killing millions. Even as plague ravaged Rome, new enemies rose in the north. Germanic tribes pressed the Danube frontier, threatening to break into Italy itself. Marcus left Rome for the military camps, enduring winters in tents with his soldiers. He ate their food, shared their hardships, and earned their respect. Yet war consumed his reign. For years he fought the Marcomanni and Quadi. Victories hard won, peace always fragile. The philosopher became a warrior out of necessity. It was during these campaigns, amid the mud and cold of the frontier, that Marcus wrote what we now call meditations. Scribbled in Greek, never meant for others, they were reminders to himself. Accept death, control the mind, act justly, resist anger, remember that power is fleeting. You could leave life right now, he wrote, urging himself to live each day with virtue. For a man commanding legions, these were not idle words. They were armor against despair. His private life was no easier. Rumors swirled about Faustina, his empress, but Marcus remained loyal, deifying her after her death. Of his many children, only Commodus survived to adulthood. Commodus, indulgent and cruel, would later unravel much of his father's legacy. But Marcus's choice reflected necessity. The empire demanded continuity, and bloodline mattered more than character. Rebellion also tested him. In 175 CE, the general Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor, believing Marcus dead. The revolt collapsed when Cassius was assassinated by his own men, but Marcus's response revealed his nature. Instead of vengeance, he pardoned Cassius's supporters, choosing reconciliation over bloodshed. In an age of cruelty, his mercy stood out. By the late 170s, Marcus was frail. Years of war, grief, and plague wore down his body. Yet he remained with his armies, refusing comfort in Rome. In 180 CE, while campaigning along the Danube, he fell ill, likely the plague again. Surrounded by generals and his son, he faced death with the calm of a man who had rehearsed it his entire life. His last words reminded Commodus of duty, though history would show the warning was in vain. With Marcus's death, Rome lost more than an emperor. It lost the rare ideal of a ruler who sought wisdom over spectacle, humility over vanity. He left behind not monuments but words, his meditations copied through centuries, guiding monks, soldiers, and leaders alike. The empire he guarded would eventually crumble, but his philosophy endures. Marcus Aurelius proved that even in an age of spectacle and blood, leadership could be rooted in virtue. He was not the emperor of bread and circuses, but of endurance and thought. The warrior died, but the philosopher lives on, whispering still that true strength lies not in conquest, but in mastering oneself.